Random Arc Entertainment presents ReD, Book 1, The Dark Pale Perspective, written and performed by Lashley-Johnstone. Chapter 33. Scream for the Sun, for the Sun, for the Sun, for the Sun, for the Sun.
Doug Harrison knew that what he had just witnessed would be seared into his memories forever, never faltering, never fading. It wasn't just what he saw, what he was still staring at, even now. It was what it meant, what it represented. He realized what he was a part of now. This would flip the world on its head. Harrison didn't think that this day could get any stranger. He had just killed for the second time in his life. It was a lot of emotions and information to process in a very short space of time, especially for his drug-addled brain. Now, though, what made it worse, terrifying even, was that he was wrong, because she definitely wasn't dead. The feeling was there, on the periphery of his conscious mind, the guilt of taking a life, a guilt that morphed, evolved, changed just like she changed, into an overwhelming, suffocating fear. She was his fear now, living and breathing. She was coming for him. He began to back away quickly, remembering how he had watched Sarah drink down her morning medication. What followed was a very painful method of suffocation, a fate he feared he would also suffer if he slowed down for too long. It took her just over 30 seconds to die. He visibly flinched as the thirst tugged at his soul, making him slow down. The feeling of desire he had enveloped him when his eyes met the red liquid for the first time. It was the same feeling now. It was a fleeting feeling, but extreme when present, almost schizophrenic. He met her dark pale eyes. They captivated him, locked him in. They made him stand still, frozen. As she made her way towards him, her arms began bending in unnatural positions, as if her structure was morphing from bone into rubber. Her face was almost pure white. The fluid that Doug was convinced seconds earlier was blood was dripping from inside her sleeves, almost gushing, as if her entire endoskeleton was somehow becoming that red liquid and was forcing its way out due to mounting, seemingly endless pressure. How was any of this possible? Her skin had visibly hardened, and her mouth was all blackened and cracked, like there was some sort of fission. From this distance, it was almost as if the cracks themselves were carved professionally, like she was turning to stone. Yet her body was becoming flimsier, making her movements almost rhythmic and whimsical. She had created a river of liquid that ran on the slightly inclined floor towards where Doug was still frozen. Her face and eyes were also bleeding, but it wasn't blood. It was more like some sort of primeval black ooze that ran thickly down her cheeks, like she was crying tar. The liquid must be thicker, closer to her vital organs, as he noticed the same thick blackness on the left-hand side of her chest and stomach, staining her white dress from the inside out. Her breathing was labored, as if she was inches from death. But Doug had killed her. He had watched her die. What the fuck was going on? Sarah, he stammered, his mouth growing ever drier and wider with shock. She didn't say anything. Maybe she couldn't say anything. She just bowed her head lower, so that Doug could no longer see her dark pale eyes. What the hell had happened to her? The fact that she was even standing upright after just drinking down a cupful of what Doug was told was pure poison was bad enough. But this was inhuman. What the hell had he given her? What the hell had the man inside given him? The fear came then, the thirst vanishing, his survival instinct kicking him in the crotch and screaming at him to keep moving. Could she hear him? See him? From where Doug was standing, it was as if she was in her own little world. As if she had headphones in, or as if someone was talking to her. Someone only she could hear, just like the man inside talked to him. "Oh God!" he screeched, as he heard her take a breath in. Wheezy would be putting it mildly. She rose her head back up. Doug continued walking backwards. He wanted to run, but he was afraid what that thing might do if he made any sudden moves. There was some sort of purple mass forming on her neck. As she breathed in and out, the mass grew and reduced in size. The swaying of her head suddenly became more intense, the sound of her voice box only being able to do so much as a deep, throaty growl. Then she began moving forward faster. Doug took out his phone, beginning to think that he might be able to find a way out of this if he just stayed focused. He had remote control of all the doors in the building. He could hide, trap her, or run like hell for the nearest exit and hope for the best. He looked down at his phone, taking his eyes off Sarah. That was when he nearly broke down. The screen was black. He tried pressing the power button, but nothing happened. The phone had been nearly fully charged only moments earlier. It couldn't have just run out. Now that he looked, he began to take in the lack of artificial light in the space around him. He had been so caught up in Sarah's transformation that he failed to notice the obvious darkness. Where had all the power gone? And how, even if it was just a standard power cut, which he doubted, would it have affected a device with an independent battery? He had to think fast. He saw that the door leading out into the adjacent corridor was hanging open. Doug might have accidentally unlocked it when he was trawling through all the security protocols. But that didn't matter. It was an open door that Doug, without stealing another glance at his now monstrous wife, decided to dart through. He picked up speed down the corridor, and that was when he heard the scream coming from where he had come into contact with Sarah. He knew it was her screaming, of course, but it was almost as if there had been a metallic voice changer layer added to her voice. But it wasn't a voice changer. Whatever was inside her was still growing. And if the evidence of the last 2 minutes of Doug's life, which seemed to last for an eternity, were anything to go by, he knew that what she was changing into was going to kill him. Not just because she had turned into this deadly, zombified-like creature. It was because he had tried to kill her first. He could feel the sweat stains that had undoubtedly formed when his eyes fell on Sarah for the first time under his armpits as he ran, the sweat clinging to the shirt and pinching the nerves at the root of the hair. Although this would normally make him produce a short, sharp cry of pain, the feelings were too distant for him to notice. He needed to escape, and he needed to do it now. The screaming from the adjacent corridor grew louder, and Harrison began to hear sounds of movement. Maybe he could outrun her. He didn't even know if he could. But if that was the case, where was he going to hide? Like the Capitol building, only the entrances and exits to the Whitehouse, and some specific rooms of importance within, were controlled from the security mainframe that existed now only on Harrison's dead phone. But doors that led into places like general meeting rooms, coat rooms, and so on were just standard lock and key. Harrison also knew that the people responsible for maintaining the Whitehouse itself were meticulous in their work. It was his company, after all. His design. Back when he had true power, before his orchestrated fall from grace. The security was state-of-the-art. And on an ordinary day that would be a good thing, but on a day like this, it would work against him hugely. He saw the open door come up on his left, and he skidded into it, bumping his shoulder hard on the door frame and almost collapsing into the room. He righted himself and went to shut the door. He was about to slam it to make doubly sure it was securely closed, but he thought better of it at the last second and pressed the handle down so that the latch of the door wouldn't make the usual clicking sound when closing on its hinges. He saw that there was a key in the lock. He He went to turn it when he heard more blood-curdling, alien-sounding screams from the end of the corridor he had just ran down. If Sarah was standing that close, she might be able to hear the click of the lock. Therefore, Harrison made the decision to leave the door unlocked, but he pressed himself against it silently, knowing there was no way he was going to let her get too close. Yes, he had known about the virus that had been released at the Capitol around an hour and a half ago now. Harrison was taking the credit for it, as the man inside had told him to do. That was the deal. Harrison agreed to take the fall for releasing the virus, getting rid of his troublesome wife along the way, and he was promised a safe retreat where he could live out the rest of his days in peace, away from prying eyes. At that moment, the thought of that place, wherever it may be, if it even existed, was the only thing that gave him even a modicum of strength. He could now hear Sarah's footsteps coming down the corridor, and the vision of that beautiful place that he had to create a picture of in his own head was now fading fast. He shook his head and tried to think, glancing at the key that was in the unlocked position next to his left hand. He brought his hand up to grip the key, to turn it if he needed to. Suddenly, the backup generator that provided emergency lighting for the Whitehouse, that bathed it in a slightly orange glow from the inside out, flashed on. Harrison stiffened. He remembered being told by one of his many presidential advisors that those lights were only necessary if there was a near city-wide power outage. He felt his confusion increasing. Then, as he finally focused his eyes on his surroundings, momentarily forgetting the perils that lay outside in the corridor, he looked across the room that was sparsely decorated with old-style sofas and chairs, and terrible wallpaper. A room that Harrison now realized he never knew existed. His eyes fell on the window that looked out onto the left-hand side of the front lawn of the Whitehouse. The city was in complete blackness. The sun had risen, but thanks to the unusually dark, harrowing, heavy clouds, there was no natural light to illuminate any sign of activity on the streets. The only sound in Harrison's ears was the relentless screaming of his former wife. On top of everything else, even if he got out of here, he would be running out into darkness with nowhere to go. More than half the city didn't just black out by chance. He couldn't even see any car headlights in the distance. This was more than just a simple power outage. Harrison looked at his watch, and his fears were confirmed. It wasn't just the citywide electrics that had gone dark. It was everything electrical in the range of what was almost certainly an EMP blast, which left Doug Harrison with an even grimmer conclusion on much more than just one front. If only he hadn't come into this room and gazed upon DC in total darkness, maybe he could have died with the amount of guilt he was already feeling. But now, things were much worse. The Capitol quarantine, although incredibly complex in design, was vulnerable to electromagnetic pulses. Therefore, upon impact of the pulse, the biological defenses within the building's makeup that prevent a possibly airborne pathogen from escaping to the outside were completely shut down. Therefore, the virus, if it was airborne, which Harrison didn't even know for sure, could escape into the atmosphere, infecting everyone who was breathing the same air, which was everyone. And, even if he did escape, he risked being infected himself. But that was the problem. The biological quarantine procedures for the Whitehouse were slightly more advanced, to the point that whenever there was any kind of electrical power failure, the building locked up upon shutdown instead of opening the doors, which was the case at Capitol Hill. Therefore, Harrison was trapped in here, and still risked infection, and therefore probably an enormous amount of pain and suffering. Harrison was between a rock and a hard place. Again, he didn't know for certain whether the virus was passed on through air or some sort of physical contact. Therefore, it was less of a risk escaping out in the open and taking his chances than it was staying in here with a monster. He felt the gun that was still weighing him down on the inside of his jacket. He hadn't yet locked the door, therefore he decided to try and silently remove the key and peek through the hole to try and determine Sarah's position. He shut his eyes tightly as the key scraped against the insides of the lock. He bent down on his haunches and peeked through the keyhole. There was a bloodstain on the door opposite, but no sign of Sarah. The screaming had stopped. He had to go back to his office to try and find some equipment that might help him escape. That was what he had to concentrate on, because it was the only way he just might have a chance of surviving this. He craned his neck to stretch it, silently slapped himself in the face to try and banish the worst of the panic, took a quiet yet deep breath, and reached for the door handle, the loaded revolver now hanging down by his side. Chapter 34 Crime Scene City Part 2. The heartbeat never changed. That was one of the amazing things. It never showed signs of stress, of slowing down or speeding up. It stayed at a constant rhythm of 3. The first 2 beats quicker than the last, with a pause of exactly half a second in between. As the warehouse came into view, Arkham slowed, taking in everything around him. The streets were empty, but there was distant shouting that was becoming clearer as Arkham moved through the alleyways, Colt python in hand. The rain was continuing to pound Arkham in the face, although his advanced tactical goggles were set to extract, blinding him to the rain and enhancing his vision, showing him what was hiding beyond this troubled veil of water that seemed too convenient. There was a sudden scratching sound of an old newspaper as it scraped against the ground and was carried past Arkham by one of the short bursts of wind, narrowly missing his face. The empty street beyond the alleyway ahead of Arkham gave him a kind of eerie feeling. He briefly removed his goggles, noticing that they were also extracting the natural mist in the air, which in itself seemed unnatural. The weather had changed far too drastically for it to be a coincidence. Placing his goggles back over his eyes, he stuck his gun out, then his head, and looked both ways to take in the sight of yet another deserted main street. Where the hell was everyone? The filter's brightness began to increase to compensate for the bipolar clouds above his head. He closed his eyes to the brightly lit scene around him, a sight that only he could see. He focused on the sound now, separating each one and laying them out on the floor of his mind, meticulously examining each of them with a different area of his brain. The screaming that he had been running towards had stopped now.
Do I have time? How long have I been away?
He was about to open his eyes and turn back, thinking that it might be a good idea to regroup with Danica and Marty. But then his brain picked up the distant screams that seemed to be sounding from various directions. This was the calm before the storm, and by the state of the skies, it was going to be a big one. People had no doubt been driving around, going about their daily lives, because there was no one in place at the time to order all the citizens indoors. When the blackout had hit, it must have taken them all by surprise. Car accidents would be plentiful. The ground beneath Arkham's feet would no doubt be stained by the dead bodies of the people of Washington, D.C. That would be due to a large amount of cars driven by people that may or may not have been obeying the rules of the road, hitting unsuspecting civilian after unsuspecting civilian head on. The complete power failure of their cars would have put them in no position to slow down. Arkham feared, sort of, for the possible victims almost as much as he feared for the mental stability of the drivers if this nightmare ever ended. He opened his eyes, and the bright light returned. These weren't just night vision goggles. He twisted the left eyepiece of the goggles 2 millimeters clockwise, and the color of the filter changed to purple. Arkham noticed a parked car to his right, and he walked towards it. He twisted the right eyepiece and zoomed in. A white border now ran around the outline of the car. Without taking his eyes off the vehicle, he reached into his pocket for his custom smartphone. Luckily, any equipment inside of the armored car, and in the compartments outside, would have been unaffected, mostly by the EMP blast. Arkham and Martin had acquired it on a day that would never be far from the front of his mind, from the front of both of their minds. The day they chose life. Arkham pressed the unlock button on the side of the phone, and the screen lit up. There was an icon flashing in the right-hand corner, signifying that it could sense the pair of goggles he was wearing, almost like a Bluetooth pairing system. He swiped his gloved hand down the middle of the screen, dragging down the taskbar, and clicked on the icon. He waited while the application he and Martin had built and coded booted up. The application was designed to control the components that had been installed in the goggles he was wearing. He smiled slightly as he remembered Martin's first prototype. Back then, the goggles had around 15 different buttons of different shapes and sizes, plastered around the band that fixed the goggles to the wearer's head, making it very heavy and thus impractical to move around in, especially when one of their primary functions is night vision. Upon the creation of the second prototype, and the application that had just finished booting now, it made it remarkably easier to switch between filters. Each filter had a different function and a slightly different color. Arkham used this Violet one for general scans. Before commencing, he inputted a command. He wanted to find out the electrical state of the car. He initiated the scan and waited while it compiled all the relevant data. Then he looked at his phone screen, which now had the readings in list form. Arkham read the words carefully. There was no electrical activity within the car whatsoever, and as he scrolled down the list to determine the cause of the complete electrical failure of the vehicle, he saw that his fears were confirmed. The pulse had taken out the car's electrics indefinitely, which meant that over half the city would only see the light when the sun broke through the clouds. Arkham looked at his watch. It was 7:13 a.m. He started walking in one of the directions of the multiple screams that were running through his head. The screaming that had made him leave the armoured car and his friends alone in the dark was pushed to one side now. He needed to see the state of the city, and he was walking in the direction of a retail park that he remembered was always thriving no matter what time it was. It wouldn't have been closed at the time of the blackout, which means that there were hundreds of terrified and more than likely injured citizens limping around in complete confusion. 5 minutes later, the retail park came into view. Arkham decided to scale the wall that separated the park from the street beyond it, in order to get a better view of his surroundings. Seconds later, he was at the top of the wall, now down on his haunches, evenly distributing his weight, staying completely still, focusing, freezing. When he looked down, goggles activated, he witnessed the carnage below him. He could see dead bodies littering the car park. Many of the vehicles were overturned. Taxis, people carriers, four-wheel drive cars. The thought came to Arkham that if the cars were travelling at least 40 miles per hour, complete electrical failure of the vehicles, depending on the nature of the blast, would fry the components completely, possibly causing the car to jackknife and roll. Fuck knows how many people were killed when the 4x4 cars were overturned at high speeds. He could see the cars that lay on the ground, wheels up, had a great amount of blood on them. There was one right below him, and he zoomed in with his goggles to scan the matter that was trickling down the car door. There were at least 4 distinct spatter patterns and blood types. His head travelled upwards, now looking straight ahead. There was a fire burning at the other side of the park. A Ford Focus must have veered off the road, smashing several people in the process and careering into one of the shop units of the retail park, thus blocking the entrance. The fire was spreading, and as Arkham dropped down from the wall, which rose up at least 25 feet above the ground, and landed, knees bent, he heard the shouts of terror coming from the inside. The EMP blast must have struck that unit when the revolving doors were in a certain position. Without the working electrical mechanism at the top of the door, it would stay locked. Those people were trapped. Arkham's next move was utterly instinctive. He started hurtling towards the disaster. The crowd of people, most of whom were stained, blood red, began clearing a path for him to get through. Despite the fact that most of them were injured, they made the effort. The way Arkham was dressed probably had something to do with it. His body armor gave him the appearance of a soldier, so they must have known he wasn't there to cause further damage.
"Conspicuous my ass,"
he said, almost smiling as he picked up speed. In the middle of the crowd, there was a man who had clearly injured his leg and was having trouble moving out of the way. The blaze continued to spread ahead of Arkham. He had to somehow create a safe passage out of there for the people trapped inside, and he knew he only had a matter of minutes. He saw the injured man's eyes flash with fear as Arkham closed the gap. In order to get there in time before the tank of the Ford Focus exploded, he would have to get through the crowd in the next 3 or 4 seconds. And as he looked, he saw that if he stayed on the ground, he wouldn't make it. He would have to take to the air. He had had a perfect amount of time during the run-up to build up enough momentum to leap clear over the remainder of the crowd. Arkham was so close to the injured man now that he could see the hairs up his nose. They too were blood-stained. Arkham pushed off, right foot first, jumping up into the air and clearing the top of the man's head by 2 meters. Arkham was now in a lying down pose in the air, the front of his body facing downwards, surveying the man's expression of pure amazement. But Arkham could still see the pain in his eyes. In the air, Arkham turned his head, now focusing on his target. There were 3 rows of people at least, another 10-meter dash before he reached the fire. Arkham did a 360-degree turn, feeling the chemically induced adrenaline that was directed to his muscles and bone structure, hardening them, making them stronger for all their task ahead. He could feel and hear his heartbeat, the slow rhythm of 3 as he cascaded towards the ground, clearing the crowd by 3 meters, landing, knees bent, then breaking into a parkour-style forward roll in order to soak up the ground force effortlessly. Without looking back, he continued running forward. He could see the people inside, choking on the thick, cloying smoke as it billowed around them, cutting off their vision. The car was close to exploding. He could hear the heat pressure rising within the engine itself. The rain was still pouring down, and it probably kept the fire at bay long enough for Arkham to make it over, but no longer. The window where the Focus had crashed through the shop entrance was slightly cracked on the left-hand side. Still running, Arkham used the weakness in that glass to his advantage, jumping up into the air again, this time heading forwards instead of upwards. He smashed into the cracked window, shattering the window pane inwards and spraying it around the shop floor within. Arkham landed on his shoulder, but felt no pain, and was immediately back on his feet, surveying his surroundings, goggles now resting around his neck. Luckily, nobody had been standing on the other side of the window that Arkham just entered through, instead preferring to keep away from the burning wreckage.
Help me!
Shrieked one of the injured shoppers. Arkham turned around to see a woman clutching her right arm in agony. Arkham felt a pseudo-surge of sorrow when he saw that her right hand was missing. She must have been the unlucky person who was already on the floor when the car came crashing through the entrance. Perhaps she had lost her footing in the darkness and fell. Once on the ground, she must have been frozen in complete shock as she saw the car bearing down on her, unable to move a muscle. It was complete chance that the car didn't take her head off, but that didn't make it okay. There was so much pain in her expression, and confusion, as if she couldn't quite believe this had happened to her, as if it was all a dream that she would soon wake up from. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was reality, which is why Arkham turned away from the woman as she passed out from the pain. She slid down the wall and ended up in a lying position, shards of glass underneath her for comfort. Arkham was going to get her out of here, but he couldn't save anyone if he didn't put out the fire.
Everyone, stay calm. I need you all to move further back. The car could go at any moment. You all need cover,
he shouted over the screams of pure terror. Most of them had clearly witnessed Arkham's entrance, and so decided not to argue. They made for as far back in the shop as they could, most of them heading for the right-hand side. Arkham lifted his goggles around his neck, strapped them round his head, and scanned the room. He needed a fire extinguisher, but it was impossible even for Arkham to see anything except ghostly black, red, purple silhouettes in all this smoke. He made a mental note to update the extraction software. The goggles located a fire extinguisher at the back of the shop floor, behind the counter. Arkham power walked towards it and then vaulted the till, nearly landing on a young child who was hiding underneath it, uninjured but terrified. Or was he terrified?
Hey, stay down,
Arkham said, softly, bringing himself down to the little boy's height. There were tears in the young boy's eyes, but he wasn't hysterical. Nor did he seem that bothered by the situation unfolding around him. Nobody knows the right way to act in situations like this, but there was something else.
Who are you? He asked. Just stay down, Arkham replied, putting a hand on the boy's shoulder. I'm going to get you out of here, he said, standing back up. Who's here with you? My Anne, the boy said, rising up slightly. And where is she? Arkham asked, looking around. The boy didn't say anything, just pointed across the room. Arkham knew then that he had to get this boy out of here alive. The boy continued pointing to the now burning corpse that lay just beyond the nose of the burning car. The boy's aunt's body was fast becoming charcoal. Arkham turned back to the boy, now recognizing those tears in his eyes as tears of pain and confusion. He could now see that there was a gap between the till and the right-hand wall, and the extinguisher was fixed to the side of it. Arkham walked over and ripped it off the wall, making the boy jump with fright. The boy regarded the pieces of wood from the till structure that were still stuck in the fixture at the side of the extinguisher. Normally you would lift it out gently, but Arkham didn't have time for that. Whoops, sorry, said Arkham. He was pleased to see that the boy was smiling a little now, which was surprising under the circumstances. Stay where you are, Arkham said. I need to get this fire under control. Keep your head down, and don't look at the fire from now on, okay? Arkham didn't want the boy to have to see his aunt being put out by a fire extinguisher. It would make her seem like she was a nuisance, rather than a human being who had just lost her life. The boy nodded and made himself as small as possible. Arkham started walking towards the fire, the extinguisher hanging down from his left hand. He took the pin out and sprayed the car down. The fire was weakening, but was never going to be put out completely. He aimed the nozzle lower, and, looking back to see the boy was turned away, doused the fire that was engulfing his aunt. She must have been the one that was hit by the car head-on, and so he could console himself in the fact that she would have been dead before the fire had claimed her body. Although most of the fire was out around the area of the car, the fire within the car itself was still going strong. Arkham knew that all he was doing was buying more time. The car was going to explode. The extinguisher was almost out. He turned to see two men lifting the one-handed woman by the underarms and legs and carrying her out to the back of the store, where most of the victims of the accident had now gathered. Good, thought Arkham. That means I don't have to do it. Now that some of the fire had subsided, the smoke in the room lessened slightly. This was also helped by the hole Arkham's body had made in the shop window. Most of the smoke was now escaping out into the open air, which gave Arkham time to look for an escape route. He still had his goggles on, and was now scanning the room again. This yellow filter searched for breaks in the structure of any building. It was doubly useful. He could either spot weakened structures that he could possibly break through, or determine the strength of the structure itself to help him figure out how much time he had before it caved. Luckily, though, the fire was localized, and he now dropped the empty extinguisher. He could see the crowd of people, half of whom he had jumped over outside of the window, staring at him in the weakening fire. He couldn't quite work out what their expressions were saying, but he had a feeling that they were expressions of ambiguity. He turned to see the same expressions, with a dash of fear mixed in, on the faces of those behind him. They were on their way out, but it was almost as if they couldn't be torn away from the carnage. He began walking towards them, changing his goggle filter to the bioscan, the green filter, and surveying their injuries. Hey, he said. The child raised his head. Can you walk? The boy nodded and made to stand up. Arkham put out his hand, and the boy took it. He pulled him slightly in the direction of the crowd of the other victims, using his body to obscure the boy's view of his aunt. No child should have to see a human being in that condition. Is there another way out of here? Asked Arkham, as a general question to the gathering. I don't want to risk getting anyone out through the front entrance. Or the makeshift front entrance. The car could go at any moment. There's a delivery entrance, came a voice from the back of the crowd. A woman limped forward. Her face was smoke-blackened and stained with blood. Arkham could see that she was wearing a name tag, and so she was likely to be an employee. Where? Demanded Arkham, now letting go of the boy's hand. Just there, said the woman. pointing to a door a couple of meters down a corridor to the crowd's left. There was a scream that came from outside, although Arkham would be expecting to hear nothing but screams from frightened civilians around him. He immediately identified this scream as an unnatural one. Through the smoke, he could see that the crowd of people outside were now facing the other way, some struggling to run in the opposite direction. Then it happened. The bodies of the living and the dead started being lifted off the ground, thrown in different directions, and landing in ungainly, twisted heaps. He couldn't see who or what was doing the throwing, but he could hear it. The noise of anger and rage. The man with the injured leg, whom Arkham had nearly knocked over, came flying in the direction of the building, heading straight for the burning car, smashing the back window of the car inwards. What followed was a sight that would remain in Arkham's memories forever. The sight of a man with peeled skin, purple red blotches covering his bare top half, ripped jeans stained with blood on his bottom. The jeans looked as if they had been bled on from the inside out. Arkham could see the blood gushing out the bottom of his jeans, as if he was pissing himself. The thing had landed right on top of the man with the injured leg, who was now clearly dead, the force of the landing or the force of the blow being too much for his body to handle. The gushing blood covered the man's skin in the colour red, the liquid dripping down his face and body. Then the noise came again. Only this time, Arkham could see the source of the sound. It seemed to be the only sound in the vast space around them, and Arkham covered his ears, along with the rest of the people in the room with him, who were rapidly beginning to make their way out the back entrance. That thing, it wasn't a man. Whatever it was, wasn't human. But maybe it had been once. The thing was evil. The thing was death, something to be very, very afraid of. All of Arkham's instincts told him to run, but he had to learn more, and he couldn't leave these people behind. The creature's teeth were blackened, the saliva also, but it was thicker, like oil. It dripped out of its mouth as the screaming continued. As the thick black liquid came into contact with the concrete, it sizzled, as if it had just been spilt out of a hot frying pan on the kitchen stove. The creature's eyes were yellow, with a blackish-green pupil in the middle. As the creature got angrier, the pupils increased in size. The noise finally stopped, and the creature, now doing nothing but staring at Arkham and the rest of the victims of the fire, no doubt seeing them as prey, the little boy gripped onto Arkham's forearm. "What is that thing, sir?" he exclaimed, more in wonder than fear. Arkham sighed, pulled away from the boy's grip, and began walking forward. "Let's find out," he replied, without looking back.